Okay, so in this video, we're going to continue going through post-classical China. In the previous video, we talked about the reemergence of Chinese empire with the Sui Dynasty and then the powerful Tang Dynasty. In this video, we're going to talk about the collapse of the Tang Dynasty and the emergence of the next Chinese dynasty, the Song Dynasty. So let's talk first about the decline of the Tang Dynasty. Now, remember, one of the biggest parts of the Tang Dynasty's superiority was their ability to distribute land to peasants. So remember that these guys required an almost continuous amount of new land added to the empire. So they needed a lot of new land added for land distribution. And so in order to do that, they had to almost continuously conquer new lands, which by itself, remember, is really expensive. But in addition to that, they had to also stretch their military pretty thin in order to do all of this. And so, like the Romans, they hired a lot of mercenary soldiers. They hired a lot of mercenary soldiers, which was also something that the Romans did and was one of the reasons why the Romans started to decline. So for the Tang, they hired Turkic soldiers. So these Turkic soldiers are from Central Asia. So the group of soldiers that they hired are called the Uyghurs. So the Uyghurs agreed to work with the Tang if they were allowed to basically take what they wanted from the Chinese capital. They were allowed to sack the Chinese capital at Chang'an. Now, I've looked this up and I can't really find any evidence of this outside of our textbook. So take this fact for what you will. But in any event, the Uyghurs asked for a lot of money, and whether or not they were allowed to sack the capital or not, they were paid a lot of money, and that really hurt the Tang economy. So over time, this kind of bankrupted the Tang. It weakened their ability to distribute land. And it also was evidence that other Turkic people could push them around. And so that led to the Tang kind of giving more and more control or conditions, not conditions, concessions all of this stuff, when we put all of that stuff together, this makes the Tang look really weak. And in 906, the dynasty just kind of faded away. It disintegrated. And again, China falls into a period of kind of civil war. But thankfully, this civil war didn't last nearly as long as some of the other ones, and we get the Song Dynasty emerges in the year 950. So about 45 years of instability gives us the Song Dynasty in 1950. Not 19, 950. Now, unlike the Tang, the Song Dynasty focused on the bureaucracy, art, and education. So that was their big focus, instead of the military. Now, this focus on the bureaucracy and art and education instead of the military means that the Song Dynasty was a lot smaller. It was much smaller than the Tang. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. A smaller China is easier to govern and keep under control. So maybe they don't need to constantly conquer new land if they can keep their people happy in other ways. So their focus on the bureaucracy cost them a lot of money. They richly rewarded their bureaucrats. So having the bureaucrats lead everything wasn't necessarily the best idea. Having bureaucrats in charge of everything led to some military defeats, increases in taxes, some peasant rebellions. But generally speaking, these were things that could be dealt with. Most governments will take a few of these things if, in the long run, things run pretty smoothly, and the Song ran things pretty smoothly. So it's not like they were perfect at this, but they were acceptable enough. Now, eventually, these guys are conquered by the Mongols in 1279. And that's where we're going to stop with this chronologically. the Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty uh, are, we kind of think of them as of two halves of post-classical China. So when we move on and we talk about China during this period, we're not really going to distinguish between Tang Dynasty stuff and Song Dynasty stuff. This is all kind of post-classical China stuff. So we're going to really kind of think about, when we move on from this, we're going to think about this time period from like the 600s to 1279. So it's kind of this 600, 700 year period. This is the period that we're going to be looking at when we talk about the economy or society. It's this stuff, it's this time period that we're going to be focusing on. All right, so moving on, let's talk about the post-classical Chinese economy. So as we've said before, China is still the world's economic engine. China is still the world's economic engine, and it runs on two things. Two things drive China's economy. The first one of these is agriculture, and the second one is innovation. So let's talk about the agriculture stuff first, because this is the easiest thing to talk about since we've been talking about agriculture for weeks now. Remember, an increase in food pretty much always leads to an increase in population, which is going to lead to an increase in specialized labor and innovation. So agriculture and innovation are kind of linked this way. One of the important agricultural changes that happens during this period is the introduction of Vietnamese fast ripening rice. So remember that the Tang Dynasty took over large pieces of Vietnam, and when they did, they brought back this fast ripening rice back to China. Now, this fast ripening rice could produce 2 times or sometimes 3 times as much rice as typical Chinese rice. So there was a lot of rice. So this means that no one is going to starve. There's no more starvation. Well, I don't mean no more. We'll say less. There's less starvation. But this also leads to another interesting economic phenomenon, because rice is so cheap, you could grow other things and buy rice to eat with your profits. So you might be able to grow fruit or vegetables, things that aren't rice, sell those things, and buy rice because the rice is so plentiful and cheap. If you remember, this is kind of like what the Greeks did when they traded olive oil and wine and bought other grains. Here, the Chinese are doing it just because rice is so cheap and so plentiful. You could grow other things and buy rice with the profits you make from selling those other things. All of this increase in agricultural production and population leads to some of the largest cities in the world at the time. So, for instance, the city of Hangzhou had over 1 million people in it. And a good portion of that, like tens of thousands of people, were foreigners coming to do trade in China. Now, as we discussed earlier, all of this agricultural stuff, the increase in food and increase in population, also gives us an increase in specialized labor and innovation. And we see a lot of that happen in post-classical China too. So, for instance, I'm just going to throw out some of these important innovations and inventions. Porcelain. Porcelain is basically, well, let's do like this. Innovation. So we've got the porcelain. Porcelain is like super fancy and light pottery. It's the final form that pottery takes. And porcelain becomes so widely associated with China that we even call it that. So we call this stuff our fine China because it's so associated with China. Porcelain comes from China that we even now call porcelain China. We see a better form of coal called coke, which is basically coal with all the impurities burned out of it. This makes it burn a lot hotter, which allows you to make steel. Maybe the most influential of these inventions was gunpowder, although the Chinese really didn't know what to do with it when they first invented it. It was first used as like fireworks, but then eventually it turned into like rudimentary cannons. But even these cannons weren't all that useful on the battlefield. They mostly just scared horses, which is useful in its own right, but not how we normally think about how gunpowder is used. They did invent the printing press during this period, but it wasn't all that useful. Due to the way the Chinese language works. So there are hundreds of characters in the Chinese language, and the printing press kind of needs a smaller number of characters to actually be useful, which is why it's really useful when it's invented independently by the Europeans, who can make use of their smaller alphabets. In terms of transportation technology, they invented the compass. and lots of other kind of related maritime technologies. So they invented things like waterproof oils to put on their sails, iron nails for their boats instead of using like wooden pegs. So a lot of this stuff is going to move on trade routes. So that stuff we're going to see diffuse out of China and eventually show up in other places through trade with China. The last thing that I want to mention, and I'll just put this over here, is not so much a technological innovation, but an economic innovation. And that's the idea of credit and checks for merchants. So the Chinese are some of the first to use the idea of a check. So you could, instead of taking with you large like bags or boxes full of money, you instead take a piece of paper with an amount on it that your bank will guarantee for a certain amount of money. So it makes trade easier. But we also see during this period the first use of paper money. So this was done during the Song Dynasty. We see this in the year 1024. Now, paper money was used because so much metal was used for other things. So there wasn't really enough metal to use for coins anymore. Now, no one really liked or trusted paper money, and it was soon gotten rid of. But this was an innovation that maybe was a little bit ahead of its time. The problem with paper money, of course, was that it was very easy to counterfeit. You could make fake money. And so people didn't trust it. So eventually they went back to using metal coins. But the idea of paper money is now out there because paper is so much cheaper and it's so much lighter than metal coins. It may have just been a little bit ahead of its time. So I'm going to stop there. In our next video, we're going to look at the kind of social and cultural side of post-classical China. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.